Welcome back, everybody, to the Safety Gap podcast. This is Cassidy, and I have my co-host Karin here. Karin, happy holidays. How are you?
I'm good. I'm actually ready to be back and kicking the year off. I'm energized.
Yeah, and like true fashion, back means you're not at home. So typically, I think we record these on Friday, and you're back in Colorado after a week of travel. But today is a Tuesday, and you're on the road. So where are you this week?
I am in New York City, headed back home today, barring any major snowstorm delays or cancellations. But yeah, New York City, home office.
Just getting right out there. The year
Right
is
out
just
there.
started. Karen's on the road at the home office. Well, it's good to see you, and hope you had a wonderful holiday. Super excited about our guest, Dr. Michelle Lilly. Michelle, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you guys?
We're
Hanging
doing
in
well.
there?
How was your holiday? Good?
They were good, but kids finally went back to school today as of this morning.
Hooray.
So, we're having some quiet in the home,
Yeah.
some actual work productivity.
We just figured out, Michelle and I, that we live maybe 5 miles apart, and our kids just went back today as well. So that was
Yeah.
much needed. It's a time for them to go back to school. That was a long break.
Yeah. It was very long. I think 18 days they were off of school.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
crazy.
Time to
Speaking
get
of
back
mental
into
health,
routine.
Yeah.
that does wonders for my mental health.
Routine is
Speaking of
good,
the
right?
topic of mental health, it'd be great, Michelle, if you could kind of give us some background of your history here and kind of how you got into this topic, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Illinois. So I've been trained in evidence-based treatments for PTSD, depression, anxiety. But I'm also a researcher, and I started my full-time role at Northern Illinois University back in 2009. So I've been there 15 years. And early in my career, in about 2011, well, actually 2010, I had a non-traditional undergrad working in my lab, and she kind of disclosed to me that she had previously been in 911 as a telecommunicator. And I talked to her about a little bit of my previous work with law enforcement. And a couple days later, she came back to me and said something like, "Hey, I don't know if you know this, but there's like literally no research on psychological health in 911." And so she really leveraged her connections and took the lead on the project. And I was really just supporting her. And in 2012, we published the first paper on post traumatic stress disorder in 911 telecommunicators. I had no clue at that point that this would launch what it has launched over time. I thought it would be a project or two and then move on. And the 911 field has forbade me to leave. So continued to do research and clinical work with 911 telecommunicators. I work extensively with law enforcement as well, a little bit with fire and EMS in addition.
And so, how would you summarize kind of just what you found in this journey? I find it quite interesting that you just kind of, I wouldn't call it stumbled into this, but that you mentioned you're like, hey, this might be a project and so forth. And then it became a career and you're a leading expert on it. So I'd love kind of just, how has it been through this journey of like discovery of the impact of mental health, obviously, and with 911 telecommunicators?
Yeah, it's been really eye-opening, quite honestly. So I thought, when we did the first project, we found that the rate of PTSD is about consistent with what we see in law enforcement, as well as other first responding populations. And I think out of the gate, that was not terribly surprising to me. But the more I learned about 911, the more time I've spent in agencies and at conferences, the more it's become clear that it's not just about post-traumatic stress disorder, that many people, regardless of whether or not they're experiencing PTSD or experiencing conditions like depression or anxiety that have kind of naturally developed from some of the extensive and cumulative exposure to trauma. We're seeing, I have a graduate student in my current lab who's very interested in the concept of moral injury, which we're starting to look into with 911. So moral injury is kind of a psychological injury after you feel as though maybe you've failed to prevent atrocity from happening to others in ways that violate your moral code. And so we're really starting to kind of think about and conceptualize that in first responders and 911. And I did not realize when I started getting into the field the extent of physical health conditions in the 911 field. I have a paper looking at the extent of obesity. So obesity is about 53% in 911 telecommunicators, and a total of 83% are overweight or obese, rampant kind of physical health complaints that people are experiencing. And so I just think the extent to which the 911 industry really needs support and proactive intervention has just become more and more clear over time.
And so, Karin, maybe if you could set the stage then of for those who may not be thinking about the 911 day in and day out, can you kind of paint the picture of just like typically what a telecommunicator goes through for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, they walk into work anticipating sitting at a workstation that has multiple screens, and they know at any given time they're going to be answering the phone to who knows what comes in, and multiple of those types of unknown calls are going to come in, and then answering radio transmissions, providing information to field responders, not knowing what they're going to do. So every single moment is a guesswork. And until you answer that phone or answer that radio transmission, you have absolutely no idea what is on the other end. And so a lot of times, maybe it's the mundane. I'm working day shift and we have traffic accidents that are happening because of the inclement weather. Okay, we kind of get used to that until the really bad crash comes in or somebody calls in that is screaming in panic and can't tell you what's happening and your anxiety rises. And so you're like on a roller coaster that's on fire and you can't get off that ride until the end of your shift. But then at the end of your shift, you still are feeling like you're on that roller coaster that's on fire because you haven't been able to process anything yet. And so every day you go in, again, just not knowing. You can have 45 domestic violence calls in one day, and every single one of them has a different component to it. And then you mix in like the complaints about a neighbor's dog that's barking while you're talking to somebody on another line whose child may be choking on something, right? And so because 911 varies across the country, not every telecommunicator is always dedicated to that one call at a time until that call's finished. Sometimes you have to put something on hold to answer another call. And so just giving that broad scope of, I could be dedicated to one person through their trauma and their emergency at this time, or I could be putting other people on hold while I'm going back to try triage and prioritize these different calls that are coming in, and then mix that in with radio traffic and the people that I know out in the field who are responding to these emergencies. When they come on the air and, they're having their emergency, whether they can only key up the mic and you hear all the background noise, we already start visualizing what could be happening. And that visualization of what we're creating in our head is usually much worse than the situation actually is. And on top of that, we're trying to put our own family members or friends into that frame of picture. So I'm thinking about my children while I'm taking this call. And so my anxiety levels are rising and I have to stay calm and kind and polite and ask all the appropriate questions and give all of the information timely and stay very calm on the radio so that I don't impact the other responders. So it's, all of those things.
Yeah, and I think the thing I find quite interesting is in your story, Karin, is like you're visualizing this image in your head in kind of a few ways. One is initially with the caller, but then you're on the radio with the first responder and you're hearing kind of that traffic, and then you're obviously worried about them as well as the person on the phone. And so you, like we all would do, is you paint this picture in your head, and oftentimes you assume the worst. And rightfully so, given the job that, oftentimes people are calling because things are bad. Michelle, how do we deal with that in this industry where, historically, and this maybe get to your white paper, but historically, all you had was audio and voice, and the image is being painted in your head with no other input other than what you just hear. And obviously, you're hearing bits and fragment of the conversation of what's happening. So in your research, like what have you found around ways that we can kind of work around this situation to better the mental health of the telecommunicator?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And I think I don't have a data-driven response to that yet. So, I know what we do know is that 911 telecommunicators become, and all first responders, but I think especially 911 telecommunicators become very masterful at suppressing their emotions because they have to. Right? You have to keep, as exactly as Karin was talking about, you're experiencing, maybe a parent who's having an extreme crisis at home with their child. You yourself might be a parent and you have to stay calm and polite and stay calm on the radio. And so that takes some very advanced emotion suppression skills. So we know that that is one of the main ways that people deal with the emotion in the moment. And it's effective, right? You kind of have to do it. You can't be freely emoting and crying and screaming because I'm not going to help the situation. But when suppression becomes kind of the only or primary ways that you cope outside of the job, then it can have more pernicious impacts. In terms of how do we deal with that, what I always say to people is just keep talking. It's really hard when you talk all day, right? And you hear people talking all day. But the more that we can encourage people to, if they've had a particularly troubling call, to grab a peer, grab a friend, grab somebody and just say what happened. That in itself can sometimes short circuit longer term suffering because people don't then start engaging in a long term avoidance cycle that can really prolong distress. So, talking, I think a lot of agencies are moving towards integrating formalized peer support with trained peer supporters in the agency. And I think that has a lot of legs. I think that's going to be really, really important. And what we also really need to be doing is setting up agencies where there's psychological safety to just say, man, that was really terrible. And man, it's a week later and I'm still kind of struggling with that call. There's been a long-term history of kind of suck it up and, rub some dirt in it. And we know that that actually just prolongs suffering. So we need management, leadership, peers to be saying, it's okay to sometimes be affected by calls. We as humans, we are having very human reactions to the suffering of others, and that's a very normal thing. So we need to be reducing stigma, normalizing some of these reactions, talking, integrating peer support networks. Now, do I have direct data specific to 911 on that? No, but that is kind of informed by a vast literature out there in the general population and with other first responder populations.
Maybe this is a question to both of you, and Michelle, you can go first. And that is, where do you think we are on the spectrum of being proactive in dealing with these types of issues in 911? Are we kind of at the early adopter phase where, the top 15% of agencies really have a handle on this? Do you feel like we are seeing agencies handling this pretty effectively across the board? Like, where in this journey are we, would you guess?
That'd be really hard to estimate. And I would say that when I first started doing this, after the first couple of years, I'm like, okay, well, now everybody knows and we can move on. And it's like, no, no, no. Like over a decade later, I will I do some consulting as well. So I'll go into agencies and I'm like, there is no discussion of mental health or wellness. There's kind of no systems in place. There's not even kind of some of the basic checkboxes of having, for example, an employee assistance program. So there's some agencies that are kind of early adopters, right? So they have a lot of different cool mechanisms in place, whether or not that's peer support or having a vetted retained clinician that people can reach out to. I know that in some places, 911 have been added to kind of larger employee assistance programs specific to first responders. I know sometimes when I'm down in Texas, there's some really great programs such as those. So that's great, but that's not the rule. I think that's more the exception. I would say that, and it's kind of hard to say, right? Because the agencies that I'm being asked to consult with are those that are not doing very well. But a lot of the agencies that I walk into are they're just starting to have these conversations. And so they've got a long ways to go.
Yeah, Karin, anything you would add to that based on your experience, given that, you're talking to agencies, I would say it feels like multiple a day.
Yeah, I would say that certainly mental health before was stigmatized. So it was the environment of suck it up, buttercup, like on to the next call. We don't have time for your feelings and emotions here. Just like do your job. And that's no longer accepted. And so as I think even the new generations come in, like we need to be able to deal with our emotions in a safe environment and have that psychological safety, as she mentioned. And we're getting new leadership in that is realizing that importance. And it's not enough anymore to just check a box and say, here's your EAP. We're now adopting new technologies that are allowing us to identify early on when somebody has received a certain amount of high priority calls so that we can target them to do those follow-ups and checkups, et cetera. So I think it's certainly, I would say we're still in the early adopter phase, Michelle. And as there is more recognition for all first responders that include telecommunicators, it can grow from there, but we are still in a struggle where telecommunicators aren't always recognized as first responders. They are still recognized as secretarial staff, so they don't always have the right resources. And so it's going to take that executive leadership from the police, the fire departments, if you have a communications center that is in your building and under your purview, that you need to be bringing in those telecommunicators and understand that they suffer too. And so it's great that you have programs for police and for fire. Your telecommunicators are that front line. And if you look at every major incident and look at the mass events that happened during the new year in Las Vegas and in New Orleans, those were initiated by 911 calls. So telecommunicators were taking in those first indicators of events that were happening. They're not always talked about. So I think that there's awareness that has to happen to appropriately resource or provide them the resources needed.
Yeah, Karin, I'd love you to double click on this point that you made, and that is because 911 are not considered first responders, they don't actually get the services that their counterparts are getting in, law, fire, EMS, et cetera. Is that like what? Can you elaborate on that? Given like this could be
Absolutely.
the same agency effectively, but they're not getting the same level of service. Is that how I heard that?
Yeah, absolutely. In many agencies across the country, when an incident happens, a major event, whether it's an officer involved shooting or another type of incident, usually the people that were involved in that will do like a critical incident debrief. And so they bring everybody together to kind of talk through how that situation went. Most often, 911 is left out of that. And they don't have an opportunity to come together and share what their story was, their involvement, or hear the other perspectives. And so when you're isolated from that kind of a group, you don't necessarily know how to share your feelings or what you can say to somebody else. And you start to question, at least in my experience, you start to question, like, is it normal for me to feel this way? Should I have felt something different? Because in that other incident, somebody else felt different. So maybe I'm not. And so you start to, like, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
have this mind game, right? First responders have access to certain mental health resources, or maybe it's extra time in a different way. So you'll have clinicians that you can send your field responders to. Those clinicians may not be available for your 911 telecommunicators. They may have to go to EAP, which maybe that's perfectly fine and they have resources there. But those resources may not understand the impact of dealing with somebody that is having crisis and in an emergency and that telecommunicator or first responder mentality. And so when those telecommunicators are left out, in my opinion, we're kind of causing more harm. So there's a big movement that's been happening over the years. It's actually started by Norma Torres called the 911 Saves Act that still has not been passed. So to anyone listening, go and look up the 911 Saves Act and get your representatives to sign this to recognize 911 telecommunicators as first responders through the OMB. So this is the Office of Management and Budget that does the job classifications. Until across the country they are properly recognized, they will not properly have the resources. And it takes this groundswell effort from directors across the country to start a program, to find a program, to fund a program. So we need adequate funding as well as recognition as first responders. And, we're certainly not taking away anything from those that are out in the field, seeing, touching, feeling, and doing the investigation. Like, we take nothing away from that. Also, the telecommunicator is dealing with their own experiences by receiving that audible information. And now as we enter into seeing things too, and maybe it's going to be more helpful, and I would love to kind of double down on that one. But we don't know, quite frankly, because it's still new. Video to 911 and video from 911 is still very new for us. So in part, we need to be classified as first responders also and have access to appropriate resources, especially as 911 it's used every single day, multiple times a day for various emergencies and non-emergencies alike.
Yeah, that's kind of asinine. I mean, as somebody who's not been in this space very long, when you hear that, you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Of course they should be classified this way and get the help. And be included in these, debriefs that happen after the fact. It's bizarre. I want to jump into what you alluded to, Karin, around video, but let me ask one question first with Michelle, and that is kind of teeing up this latest study. It seems like in your research that, there's like a stat in there on PSTD that the impact on 911 is consistent with the impact on first responders, those in the field, meaning there is no real difference in terms of like the impact on the individual. So kind of going back to like why resources are important, it sounds like they're going through the same level of trauma as anybody else. Is that fair? Did I read that correctly?
Yeah, it's really hard because like when I first started doing the research, people would say, well, they can't have PTSD. They're not in the field. And it was like, well, that's not not true. So obviously the inciting incident can be quite different, right? You have a cop who's on the field or fire, they're literally at the scene of the fire. But the impact that these traumatic experiences have at a kind of at a brain level, at a psychological level as well, are the same. We can see PTSD symptoms in 911 regardless of the fact that they're not on scene. And in fact, there's some factors like not being on scene and not seeing what's happening that can actually increase risk for things like PTSD because, as Karin kind of alluded to earlier, sometimes you're filling in the details and what you might be telling yourself about what is happening is far more maybe gruesome or traumatic than is actually happening.
So let's talk a little bit about that. And I think one of the things that caught our eye in your recent white paper is this study is around next gen 911 technology. And we've been rolling out video to 911 for 911 in a variety of different form factors. And I would say a lot of the feedback we've gotten from the field, it's a cohort of feedback we're getting from the field is we don't want to look at the video. And there's things we're doing to blur it out and so forth and so on and putting the control in the hands of the telecommunicator. So, technically they don't have to look at it if they don't want to, but we're getting kind of this feedback of like, why would I want to do that? Now, your research sort of indicates that maybe it's good to look at it because to your point, you're kind of filling in this image in your head with facts versus kind of, perception. But I'd love you to I might have butchered that, so I'll let you kind of clarify what you found in this, research. I understand it's early days, so.
Yeah. Well, it is early days because I actually don't have like the data on that yet. Like we're working on getting that data because, we need enough agencies and telecommunicators to have been exposed to this to actually see what the true impacts are. So, but my argument from knowing what we know about post-traumatic stress disorder from a robust and probably multi-billion-dollar endeavor to study and understand PTSD, how PTSD develops, why it develops, we can kind of take from that and make theoretical predictions about how this is going to go. And so the research we don't have enough of it yet. Now, I do have a very early pilot study where we looked at folks from across the country who have handled video calls. And to date, the data looks pretty dang good. People who have adopted it had said that generally speaking, and it's been helpful to them or net neutral. I think in the study, we only had a handful of people, a very small percentage. I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head, so I don't want to quote it. But that said that, yeah, they really wish they hadn't seen a call, right? But I don't think that that's any different than an telecommunicator who says, I would have liked to handle X type of call, regardless of whether or not there was video or not video. And, there will be safeguards in place in terms of being able to turn it off. And ideally, a lot of agencies are adopting it, and they're first adopting it with the people in the center who are most eager and willing to give it a try. So, and that's really what I've seen. So, but there is just this very strong knee-jerk, when I go do trainings, there's this very strong knee-jerk reaction to like, I don't want to see it. There's a lot of misconceptions like, I don't want people to see me. I'm like, it's not a two-way camera. And people really feel like there's a reason I did this versus this. Like, I don't want to see it. But I think the more that we can share the wins and all the stories that are coming out where having access to this technology saved lives is going to help combat some of that knee-jerk reaction that I see literally all the time. People just say to me, they're like, don't you think it's terrible? And I'm like, no, I don't, right? Mostly I'm a scientist. I want the data first. But again, from the PTSD literature, we can make predictions that this could be a net psychological win for the industry.
So when you say from kind of the historical literature, what I hear is generally the more information you can give to someone, in theory, the less impact that has on them because of just this mental picture you're creating in your head with very little information. Is that kind of just generally, not talking about 911, but in general with PTSD, is that kind of like what's been found in other environments? Is that kind of how I should take it?
Yeah, our brains thirst for knowledge, right? We like to know why, right? That's kind of as central as human beings. This is like our search, right? We always want to know why things happen. In order for us to kind of process things that have happened to us, we need to make meaning of it. And when there are gaps in our knowledge, when we don't know what happened, when we don't know the outcome, even if the outcome is bad, sometimes knowing the outcome can better help process the event than not knowing at all. So generally speaking, we know just from a pure kind of brain and cognitive perspective that having more information is generally a good thing for us.
On one hand, that feels intuitive, but on the other hand, I can completely understand why somebody would be like, "Well, I don't want to look at a video because I don't want to see that." And what you're explaining is, well, it may actually help you by being able to see that. How does that conversation or kind of education go down in kind of a typical situation? Because I assume the first reaction is like, no, don't give me that information. I don't want to see that.
Yeah, I don't know if Karen has any kind of thing to add to this, but from what I've seen in a lot of the 911 agencies that have started to adopt NG 911 technology, they've started by asking for like the volunteers or having people step forward who are more eager. You know, for every training I go to, I will tell you that there's usually a decent sized contingency of people who are like, no, I do not want to see it. But there are always people in the room who are like, I want to have it. It's another piece of information. It could be very helpful. It can help save lives. The more that we help save lives, the less guilt and shame we might have, the less mistakes we think we might make if we can actually lead somebody if that information is critical in providing them the care that they need. So I have seen a couple agencies too where it's a little bit the Wild West. They just kind of throw it out there and it's a little, I'm like, wow, that's bold. So I've seen it go all over the place, but there are a lot of people in the field who are eager to adopt it. And I think the more that we can have those folks step forward and be trained first and show that this can have really positive net benefits, then we'll have more and more of that kind of data to share with other folks who might be more resistant. And depending on the size of an agency, some agencies might be able to keep people who don't handle these types of calls at some point. So, but again, it's a little bit of the Wild West right now in terms of how people are doing that.
Yeah, Karen, I'm going to put you on the spot. My sense and what I hear from our team is very consistent with what Michelle outlined. We run the spectrum of agencies and how they think about this and how they're trying it out or not trying it out. But maybe you can kind of add some color to that in terms of like what you're seeing day in and day out.
Yeah, I think there's varying levels. So certainly there's the agencies who say, hey, give me volunteer, let's pilot or test it and kind of see how it goes, right? And that's phenomenal to have those leaders empower their staff to be able to do this. And there's agencies like out in the West Coast who have actually been using video since like 2015, before video was even a thing. And what they have learned and realized is, number one, I have the option to ask for this video. It is not going to just drop in my ear or drop in my eyes like a 911 call does. So it is my choice. So I am preparing myself mentally to click a button to access that information. So I think that's kind of the first step. And so what they've realized is like, yes, we prepared our staff that they may potentially see something bad. They may potentially see the worst case scenario. But what they found is they've not had those cases with the exception of maybe one, and it wasn't terrible. What it's helped them with, though, is better describe the scene or the situation when the caller couldn't relay what was actually happening. And so clear visual was the telecommunicator was then able to tell the story better to the field responder. So that improved the outcome out in the field as well. And so now we're actually improving some of the teamwork inside of our operations because we had better information and clarity of the situation that was happening. So I think there's that. Also, I've run into agencies where maybe it's not just the 911, center leader, but it was the executive of that office. So maybe it was like a police chief or captain or something else who said, we don't want our telecommunicators to see video or to see images. And I would just challenge that thought that while they are not trained as patrol officers, that information is beneficial to them. And it is our job as leaders of organizations and agencies to give them the tools that are going to help them. So talk to your telecommunicators, because and I've sat with major cities and said, what do you wish you had access to? What do you wish you'd have the ability to do? And they would point things out like, these people across the room who have a badge on and are sworn have access to traffic cams, like simple traffic cameras, to just visualize that, hey, yes, this car that was involved in the incident, I can see it. I can see the direction of travel because maybe my caller said they were going northbound, but I saw them going southbound. I can make better decisions for my responders when I have access to appropriate information. So I kind of challenge all of the executive leadership out there to really talk to your folks that are using and that are doing the frontline work and allow them to utilize the tools. Don't hold them back, because I have seen that too. And I think that that's going to stop or kind of harm the adoption of NG911 systems. Now, we've been talking about NG911 for my tenure, so, 27 years, 25 years. And we've been talking about video to 911 for all this time. And it's always been, I'll retire then if that happens. Well, guess what? We're using video with FaceTime. We're using video with all these other things. We've gotten used to it a little bit more with telehealth. So I think as a natural progression that it will continue to grow over time. And I think it's going to be much quicker this time because technology evolves much faster. So, even over the next years, and I see too the sudden rise in real-time crime centers kind of playing that analyst role, being first eyes on scene for the field folks also. And so that's a really great way to partner with your real-time crime center is if you don't want to see the eyes right now, maybe they have the eyes until you can adopt it in 911. So, whether that's a staffing challenge, adoption, training, whatever, partner with those agencies that have your real-time crime center and figure out how do you partner together so that you can adopt video to 911 or, video into the field. Because it really, honestly, I can see that it helps. I got 2 stories yesterday, actually, from an agency, former dispatcher working in real-time crime now, how much time they were able to save to just have the camera on the scene, knowing that there was a 911 call in this area. So
That's powerful. And, with the technology we're putting in place, it's like literally a click of a button now.
yes.
Everybody has a camera in their pocket, and we've made it pretty easy for you to access that at your discretion.
Well, and if you think about the community is evolving too. So the way that they're connecting with emergency services, they have different expectations. So we also have a duty and responsibility to meet the community where they are. And, if they're going to be getting away from a voice call and using sensors and other buttons, they also are out videotaping things. They want to share imagery. They want to send pictures of the suspect vehicle that did XYZ.
Yeah, it's a really good point. We're going through this analysis of some of the recent incidents over New Year's Eve. There's always video footage after the fact.
Right.
And,
Yes.
now, the technology exists to use that video footage like during the incident if we want to. Interesting. So, Michelle, how you mentioned that you have some pilots going on and some studies around this. We also talk to and work with pretty much every 911 center. How do they get involved? What if I'm out there and I'm like, hey, I'm going to start introducing video at my center. I would love to understand the impact of that. Do they just give you a call? Is that something like, how does that work?
Yeah, if a lot of how I started the first pilot study on this is I just kind of used the social network that I have within the 911 industry to be like, hey, get people to fill this out, right? Which was fine. And we did get a good sample. A lot of people have not kind of stayed in the study, which is part of research. People get really excited. And then 3 months later, you're like, could you just fill this out for like 10 minutes? And they're like, I'm busy, right? So retention has not been great, but we are still getting people to do the follow-up surveys. But I really want to redo the study with agencies at more of like an agency-wide level because I think it's more systematic to do it that way. I think having a whole group that's perhaps adopting this all at the same time can be very, very helpful. So yeah, if you guys are out there or anyone listening is working with an agency and you're about to adopt this technology, like please reach out to me. I would be more than happy to work with you. And it might be helpful for you too to have your agency level data for your own stakeholders. So I think that there are a lot of potential benefits to it. So I would love to do this with agencies that are about to adopt because I think they'll also retain people better too. Like there's investment in your own workplace. That would be a great next step. My bandwidth is like, so I haven't reached out to individual agencies yet.
Well, I'm confident we can help with that.
Yeah.
And you bring up a really good point on retention. Obviously, staffing is an issue.
Yeah.
And I assume often staffing is an issue because of the stress of the role. And so kind of the dot you're connecting here, you said it a few times, is by providing kind of better technology, better support, better education, all the stuff that Karin, you mentioned, this actually should have a direct impact on your ability to retain your employees, which is obviously a big challenge. I assume I got that correct.
Yeah, I've been part of two kind of large state level research surveys in the last year. And when we ask people the long list of all the reasons why staffing is a problem, stress, mental health, and then leadership management are the top two reasons. And I see that pretty much everywhere I go. So the more that we can have leadership and management be thoughtful in their adoption of these things and support mental health and wellness, the more training and education. So sometimes people don't even realize that basics like, hey, emotional suppression is not good for you. People are like, really? And you're like, right, let's not do that. Right. So I think the more education and training we can do on stress and wellness and resilience building, the better, particularly as we're trying to adopt these technologies that people are very fearful of adopting.
Yeah, so it's interesting, these two reasons, stress and mental health and leadership, or I would assume lack of leadership. My assumption here is these two things are highly correlated. Poor leadership leads to probably poor focus on mental health and stress, which leads to folks wanting to go find another job. And that's basically every industry has this, these two things I assume are correlated in all the time. But, I'm not, you have the data. So is that fair?
I think it is fair. I think what's also very hard is this newer generation. They will protect their mental health, right? Which I think is going to be a good thing for first responding culture. I think that there's less stigma talking about mental health and better boundaries around wellness and saying, I'm not going to pick up extra overtime because I don't want to, right? Which is not kind of the history of these industries. So I think that that's a good thing. But at the same time, this younger generation, I mean, if they can make slightly less going to work at, Target and not have to deal with the stress and missing holidays and having to work Friday nights or Saturday nights or work 12-hour shifts, they're going to make that decision. And so it's a real challenge because the number three reason is often pay, right? 911 is not, I think, getting paid at a level commensurate with other first responding careers. And oftentimes the stress of this job is not worth the pay when you could go do something far less stressful.
Yeah. Well, hats off to the younger generation. I mean, poor leadership, stressful situation, and not getting paid very well, I would go find another job as well, unfortunately. I mean, versus, I think, I hate to say it, I grew up in the era when it was suck it up. Keep your mouth shut, work your ass off. And I'm glad that the world is changing for the better on that. So
Yeah.
that's great. Where does your research take you next?
Oh gosh. I mean, that's a great question. So I have a couple projects out there looking at the impacts of peer support. Again, this NG911 question is still kind of front and center for me. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in the concept of moral injury. And I think moral injury is a kind of psychological injury that is kind of the silent epidemic among 911 and first responders more broadly. So as Karin was talking earlier about, you might have to put one person on hold to answer this call over here. Well, what if you do that and this original call that you put on hold, something really catastrophic happens, right? Or you feel like you've made a mistake, or there's shifting protocols that you can't dispatch because everyone's understaffed and something happens to somebody. So I've heard so many stories from across different first responder industries, including 911, where people are really struggling with this. People go into this job oftentimes because they care about people and they want to save lives. And when you perceive yourself as to have underperformed or misperformed or made a mistake, or even if you didn't perceive yourself to make a mistake, the fact that you're kind of part of this chain, a sequence that was unable to save somebody's life, that can be really, really painful. So I'm very interested in the concept of moral injury and shedding light onto the ways in which it's impacting the first responding community.
I'm still trying to grok in my head the definition of moral injury. Could you?
Yeah.
I know you defined it earlier, and it didn't stick. This is a fascinating concept, and as you explain it, I'm like, okay, how do I summarize this?
Well, the moral injury construct was first kind of recognized and started to be studying within the VA, the Veterans Administration, because they recognize that, you have people coming back from war who did things in war that they would have not done in their regular civilian life. In the context of war, people are sometimes take another life. Those types of incidents can run deeply counter to your morals, to your beliefs. And so it can cause what we call cognitive dissonance. Can I continue to think about myself as a moral, good person who does good things when I've done these bad things? It's marked by oftentimes a very high level of guilt and shame. And that guilt and shame is often makes it as an extra barrier to people getting the help and assistance they need to process it. And makes them less likely to disclose and seek social support because of that shame and that guilt and the embarrassment for having done something that is perceived to be immoral or immoral. And so it really came out of the VA system, but then it was very quickly, people were like, okay, well, this very clearly has implications for the first responding field. So I'm married to a police officer, and he could probably tell you 20 stories off the top of his head of times when he was mandated to or did something that he felt was not what he would have done if it weren't in the heat of the moment. And very technically, he followed the protocol of his agency, but somebody got hurt or somebody didn't get help in time or, X, Y, or Z. And so I think it really is a kind of psychological distress that a lot of first responders are carrying around, and we're not fully recognizing it.
That's fascinating. Karin, any thought? Do you want to elaborate on that? Should I put you on the spot?
Sure. So I am married to a man that was in the Army for 28 years. And there's situations that he cannot talk about and will not talk about. And so certainly there's times that you're put in a situation where, I think we're all taught to do not hurt and do not kill people. And unfortunately, a lot of times our field responders especially are put in a situation where they have a split-second decision of taking someone's life. So I can see that. For the telecommunicator, we always question anytime you hear or are involved, especially on the radio side of working an officer-involved shooting, which I've worked many of them, unfortunately, you start to question everything that you said over the radio. Did I give them enough information? Did I hold this back? Did I do this? Did I do that? And you start owning the guilt of the actions that were taken out in the field. When there's nothing that you could have done to change the situation, because that situation unfolded and you were not involved. You were not on scene. You were not there. You did not, see a person raise their hand with an object pointing it at a field unit. You could not have changed that outcome, but we own that for a very, very long time. And oftentimes we don't talk about it. And we do have that guilt and shame that we take home. And so I know that I spoke with several telecommunicators after an officer-involved shooting out in Colorado. And there was also guilt and shame on other staff members. Like, that telecommunicator wasn't even working that night. Why is she having a hard time with this? I was there. So I get to feel this way. She doesn't get to feel that way. But they don't know what that relationship was like for that person, or what other situations has that person been involved in where this opened up those wounds again. And so that creates just a whole other level of drama, injury, and then that impacts how they work every day.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. That's vividly brings home these types of scenarios. So thank you. I'll be cognizant of time. So Karin, I'll go to you. What can companies like us do, who obviously support public safety 911? What can we do to help here? Obviously, we provide technology, and sounds like this technology could actually be beneficial. What else? What else would you like to see us and others like us in this industry doing to kind of better help 911?
Yeah, I think number one, we as companies have access to resources and to, maybe representatives who are going to listen because we have a big brand or whatever. So if you're out there, advocate, talk to your representatives. If you're out talking to legislators, share with them the story of 911. If you're providing any kind of technology that touches 911, understand what we actually do and help advocate for reclassification so that they are recognized as first responders. And then think about, how are you funding things? So if you're putting money towards sponsorships and things like that, are those sponsorship dollars going towards telecommunicators being able to access certain resources, whether it's a scholarship to be able to attend trainings or, other mental health things? Like, really dig in to understand the role a little bit and how you can help. And I think as technology providers too, it is our duty and our responsibility to talk to these frontline telecommunicators so that we understand the impact of our technologies on them, and then working together with the partners, and how are we educating, how are we helping them to adopt in a better way and really truly solving problems for them. Any other resources that you have, access to, just think about that frontline telecommunicator or that frontline worker that is being impacted, and make sure that they're reaping the benefits, not just sending pizza, This is one of the things that we hear a lot from telecommunicators. At any time an incident happens, you want to respond and send something. And pizza's great in the heat of the moment, but that shouldn't be like here, we're thinking about you in a way to support.
Yeah.
Like, do you have access to therapy dogs that you can send in to help them in that moment? Do you have access to other tools and materials? Do you have a company that you work with that could give, a discount for a period of time to certain types of solutions, whether it's a calming application or something else? And these are things that I know that we at Rapid SOS have done, especially recently within the community. So any resource, any tool that you can help, just take a moment to think through what that looks like. But the advocacy work can certainly help first.
I love that. Thanks for being so specific. Michelle, anything that we should have talked about we didn't? I'm sure there's a lot, but anything that you're like, why doesn't this guy just ask me this question so I can answer it?
Oh my gosh. I mean, Karin knows I could literally talk about this stuff all day long. So we could probably do a whole series. So maybe you'll invite me back and we can continue the conversation. I think what I will say is resilience doesn't just happen. People kind of lump people into, they're pretty resilient or they're maybe not super resilient, but you can build resilience. And so you need a kind of proactive plan for your center of how you're going to build resilience in your employees. You need training and education. And for individual frontline folks, you have to have some kind of proactive self-care plan to make sure that you're in a good place to be able to manage the stress of this job. It is an extremely stressful job. Sometimes people think self-care is just going to happen, or you'll one day just randomly feel motivated to gain some self-care. That's not how it works. We're right now in the time of the year when everybody's New Year's resolutions are slowly starting to be violated. So we know that it's hard, right? And oftentimes people have all these self-care goals. They, want to exercise an hour a day, eat healthy, meditate, and blah, blah, blah. Well, ain't nobody got time for that, right? So picking one thing that you can do for yourself on a consistent basis, continue doing it until it becomes a habit, and then add something else. And so these things don't just kind of happen. They require proactive plans at the individual and organizational level.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's great. And then last question for you is where can people find you? Sounds like a lot of folks in 911 already know you, but if there are the few that maybe don't or don't have your email or contact information, what's the best way?
Yeah, I'm everywhere. So yeah, it just lilly-consulting.com is my webpage, where you can email me at michelle@lilly-consulting.com. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook. Although I'm terrible at social media, I'm really hit or miss. So, but yeah, you can find me through LinkedIn or through my webpage to see the different services that I offer. And there's a list of the publications and white papers. I don't have them uploaded onto the webpage, but if you ever want a copy of any of them, you can always email me and I'm happy to send them along.
Yeah.
Can I help her with
great.
a shameless plug real quick? That she
You
also
can.
just authored a book, and she should talk about her book too.
Oh, I'll grab it
So
real quick.
Michelle, when I ask you what else would you like to say, this is a good time to plug the book.
I don't plug books. I'm working on a moral injury book right now. However, the reason I didn't plug this book is because it's not actually about 911 or first responders. This is my book, Just Be Happy. And it's
great.
actually a personal memoir of my marriage and the challenges within it, and then the difficult decision to get divorced and what happens subsequently. So it's about kind of relational patterns and sometimes why we make difficult decisions to stay when we ought to leave. So it's available on Amazon and Kindle. It's also listed on my webpage too. So Just Be Happy. Thank you, Karin, for reminding me to do shameless plugs. I am really not good at it. Sales is not my thing.
Well, we'll make sure to link all this information in the show notes and on the blog that we do about the podcast, so everybody has access to it. But I would say it is definitely important because it really shows that you walk the talk, right? So I had to be a deeply personal book that you wrote about this topic, and for someone who researches this space, that kind of put it all out there about yourself personally, I think says a lot about you. And I think it just makes people want to work with you more. So that's my
I
2 cents on that topic.
Well, I wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe I shared that. That people can read." But then I sit with okay, there's a reason, right? So I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate the time, and we look forward to having you back on. And let's figure out what we can do together more to help out the 911 community. So thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Karin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Safety Gap. This podcast is powered by Rapid SOS, where we're dedicated to closing the safety gap through intelligent safety technology. If you're passionate about creating a safer, smarter world, be sure to follow The Safety Gap wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information and to catch up on past episodes, visit us at rapidsos.com.